The bitter wind howled like a wounded animal as Harriet Neville stumbled through knee-deep snow, each labored breath forming a cloud that dissolved into the darkening sky of Colorado's unforgiving winter. Blood trailed behind her, leaving a crimson path that would soon be covered by the relentless snowfall of January 1876. She had been left to die, abandoned by men she trusted, men who had taken everything she owned and left her with nothing but a bullet graze across her ribs and the clothes on her back. Just a little further, she whispered to herself, though she had no idea where she was going. Cannon City had to be somewhere ahead, but the mountains all looked the same in the gathering blizzard, and her strength was failing fast. The wound at her side burned like fire despite the freezing temperature, and her legs trembled with each step. Harriet's foot caught on something buried beneath the snow. She pitched forward, her hands too numb to break her fall properly. Pain exploded through her as she hit the ground, and a sob tore from her throat. She tried to push herself up, but her arms gave way, dumping her back into the snow. "Get up," she commanded herself, but her body refused to obey. The cold had penetrated too deep, and the blood loss had weakened her beyond her capacity to continue. Tears froze against her cheeks as she realized this might be the end of her 26 years on Earth. Not the life she had imagined when she'd left Boston 6 months ago, following dreams of adventure and independence in the West. As consciousness began to slip away, Harriet thought she heard the crunch of approaching hoofbeats. Probably just the wind, she told herself, or perhaps death coming to claim her. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the inevitable. Miss, can you hear me?" The voice seemed to come from far away. Harriet forced her eyes open to see a man kneeling beside her, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. Strong hands gently turned her over. "You're hurt," he said, his voice deep and concerned. "What happened to you?" Harriet tried to answer, but her lips were too stiff from cold to form words properly. The stranger cursed under his breath. "Never mind that now. We need to get you warm." He shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around her before lifting her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. "My horse is just over there," he told her. "I'll get you somewhere safe." Through half-lidded eyes, Harriet saw a rugged face with several days' worth of stubble, kind eyes the color of a summer sky, and a determined set to his jaw. A cowboy, she realized, come out of nowhere like an angel in the wilderness. "Thank you," she managed to whisper before darkness claimed her once more. Aaron Redfield had been tracking a small herd of wild horses when the storm hit. He'd planned to capture a few of the Mustangs to break and sell in Cannon City, but the weather had turned far faster than he'd anticipated. He was making his way back to his cabin when he spotted what looked like a dark shape against the white landscape. Finding a woman alone and bleeding in the mountains during a snowstorm was the last thing he'd expected. She was barely conscious when he found her, her skin pale as the snow except for her bluish lips and the smears of blood on her side. Whoever had done this to her and left her to die deserved a bullet, but that would have to wait. First, he needed to get her somewhere warm before the cold claimed her life. His cabin was miles away, and the town was even further, but he had no choice. He settled her on his horse, mounted behind her, and held her securely against his chest as he urged his mount forward. The woman was limp in his arms, her breathing shallow but present. "Stay with me," he murmured against her hair. "Just hold on." The journey was slow and treacherous. The snow fell heavier with each passing minute, and the wind cut through his clothes now that he'd given his coat to the mysterious woman. His horse struggled through drifts that sometimes reached its chest, and twice they nearly lost their way. But Aaron was a man who had lived his entire adult life in these mountains, and he knew them better than most. After what seemed like hours, the familiar outline of his cabin appeared through the swirling white. It was a simple structure, built with his own hands after he'd staked his claim 5 years earlier. It wasn't much, but it was sturdy, and right now it represented their only chance of survival. He carried the woman inside, kicking the door shut behind him with his boot. The interior was cold, the fire having died out during his absence, but it was still a vast improvement over the raging storm outside. He laid her gently on his bed and quickly set about building a fire in the stone hearth. Once flames licked at the dry wood, Aaron returned to his unconscious guest. He hesitated, knowing what needed to be done but uncomfortable with the impropriety of it. Her wet clothes would kill her if they remained on her frozen body, but he was a gentleman, despite his rough exterior. "Madam," he said loudly, hoping to rouse her. "Miss, can you hear me?" When she didn't respond, he sighed and made his decision. With careful, clinical movements, he removed his coat from around her and began to unbutton her ice-encrusted dress. He worked quickly and efficiently, averting his eyes as much as possible as he stripped her down to her undergarments. The wound at her side was a bullet graze, as he had suspected. It had bled freely but wasn't deep enough to be life-threatening on its own. The cold was the greater danger now. He wrapped her in every blanket he owned, then prepared a poultice of herbs he kept for emergencies. After cleaning her wound, he applied the mixture and bandaged it as best he could. Throughout his ministrations, the woman remained unconscious, her breathing shallow but growing steadier as warmth gradually returned to her body. With nothing more he could do for the moment, Aaron settled into a chair beside the bed to wait. He studied her face, struck by her beauty despite the circumstances. Her hair, now drying near the fire's heat, was the color of burnished copper, and her features were delicate and finely drawn. She wasn't from around here, that much was obvious from her clothing and the softness of her hands. What had brought her to these mountains, and who had left her to die in the snow? Harriet woke slowly, consciousness returning in fragments. First came awareness of warmth, then the crackling sound of a fire, followed by the realization that she was lying on something soft instead of in the snow. Pain throbbed in her side, but it was duller now, manageable. She opened her eyes to find herself in an unfamiliar cabin, wrapped in several blankets and lying on a narrow bed. Memory returned in a rush: the attack, the desperate flight through the snow, collapsing, and then a man, a cowboy who had appeared like a mirage and carried her away. "You're awake." The voice came from nearby. Harriet turned her head to see the man from her fragmented memories sitting in a chair beside the bed. In the warm light of the cabin, she could see him clearly for the first time. He was perhaps 30, with sun-weathered skin, strong features, and those striking blue eyes she remembered. His brown hair was slightly too long, curling at the edges, and his clothes were those of a working man, simple, functional, and well-worn. "Where am I?" Her voice came out as a rasp. "My cabin," he replied, rising to pour water from a pitcher into a cup. "About 8 miles from where I found you. I'm Aaron Redfield." He helped her sit up slightly and held the cup to her lips. The water was the sweetest thing Harriet had ever tasted. "Thank you," she said when she had drunk her fill. "I'm Harriet Neville. I don't know how to repay your kindness, Mr. Redfield. You saved my life." Aaron's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "No need for repayment, Miss Neville." "Couldn't very well leave you to freeze, could I?" "Many would have," she said softly, thinking of the men who had shot her and left her to die. His expression darkened. "Then they're not men at all." He hesitated before adding, "If you don't mind my asking, what happened to you out there?" "Who shot you?" Harriet closed her eyes briefly. "I was traveling to Cannon City with a group from the stagecoach after it broke down. 2 of the men, I thought they were gentlemen, they attacked me last night. They took my money, my belongings, everything. When I fought back, one of them shot me. They left me there in the snow." Aaron's jaw tightened. "Do you know their names, what they looked like?" "One was called Edwards. The other, I think his name was Buchanan. They were well-dressed, claiming to be businessmen from Denver." Aaron nodded slowly. "I'll send word to the sheriff in Cannon City when the storm passes. Those men won't get away with what they did." Harriet wasn't sure if justice was possible, but she appreciated his certainty. "How long do you think the storm will last?" "Hard to say. Could be a day, could be 3. It's one of the worst I've seen in years." He glanced toward the window where snow still fell heavily. "I'm afraid you're stuck with me for a while, Miss Neville." Despite everything, Harriet found herself smiling slightly. "I think I'm fortunate in my rescuer, Mr. Redfield." He seemed embarrassed by her gratitude, rising abruptly to tend to the fire. "You should rest. Your body's been through a lot. I'll make some broth when you wake again." Harriet wanted to say more, to properly express her thanks for what this stranger had done, but exhaustion pulled at her, and her eyes grew heavy despite her efforts to keep them open. Within moments, she was asleep once more. Aaron watched her drift off, struck by the trust she showed by sleeping so peacefully in a stranger's home. Most women he'd known would have been beside themselves with worry about their reputation, alone with an unmarried man in a remote cabin. But Harriet Neville seemed more concerned with expressing gratitude than with propriety. He wondered what had brought her to this part of Colorado. Cannon City was growing, especially since the territorial prison had been established there a few years back, but it wasn't the kind of place that usually attracted refined Eastern ladies traveling alone. As he stoked the fire and prepared to make a simple meal, Aaron reflected that it had been a long time since he'd had company in his cabin. 5 years he'd been here, living alone since leaving his family's ranch in Texas after the war. He'd wanted solitude then, needed it to heal the wounds that weren't visible on his body. Now, watching the sleeping woman in his bed, he was surprised to find that the presence of another person didn't feel like the intrusion he might have expected. The blizzard continued unabated through the night and into the following day. Aaron slept in his chair, unwilling to take the other half of the small cabin that served as his workspace. When Harriet woke again, he had broth ready, made from the rabbit he'd caught the day before. "Think you can sit up and eat something?" he asked, helping her to a more upright position when she nodded. "The wound looks better," he told her as he handed her the bowl. "Bullet just grazed you, another inch and it might have been a different story." Harriet took a careful sip of the broth. "I believe I owe you my life twice over, Mr. Redfield, once for rescuing me from the snow and again for tending my wound." Aaron shrugged, uncomfortable with her continued gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said firmly, "not anyone. You carried me for miles through a blizzard. You could have died yourself." He didn't know how to respond to that, so he changed the subject. "What brings you to these parts, Miss Neville? You're a long way from home, if I don't miss my guess." A shadow passed over her face. "Boston was my home, yes, but there was nothing left for me there after my parents died last year. I came west to start again, to build something of my own." She hesitated before adding, "I have an aunt in Cannon City who offered me a place to stay until I find my footing." Aaron nodded. "Cannon City's growing fast, plenty of opportunities for someone looking to start fresh." "And you, Mr. Redfield, what brought you to this solitary life?" It was a fair question, but one Aaron rarely had to answer since he so seldom interacted with others. "I fought in the war," he said simply. "When it ended, I couldn't go back to the life I had before. Needed space, silence, found both here." Harriet studied him over the rim of her bowl, her green eyes thoughtful. "And have you found peace as well?" The question struck him as oddly perceptive. "Some days," he admitted. "More than I had before." They lapsed into silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Aaron was surprised by how easy it was to be in her company. Most people filled quiet moments with needless chatter, but Harriet seemed content to simply exist in the same space with him, respecting the rhythm of his solitary life even as she temporarily disrupted it. The next few days passed in a similar fashion. The storm raged outside, confining them to the cabin, but inside, a tentative friendship began to form. Harriet grew stronger each day, able to sit up for longer periods and eventually to stand and move around the cabin with Aaron's assistance. He learned that she was 26, educated, and had worked as a teacher in Boston. She discovered that he was 32, had grown up on a ranch in Texas, and had fought for the Confederacy during the war, something he mentioned with neither pride nor apology, simply as a fact of his past. On the third day, when Harriet insisted on helping with the preparation of their simple meals despite his protests, Aaron found himself watching her as she carefully cut vegetables for a stew. There was a grace to her movements, a quiet determination that he admired. She had survived an ordeal that would have broken many, yet here she was, insisting on contributing rather than merely accepting his care. "Tell me about your family," she said, catching him watching her. "You mentioned you left Texas after the war. Do you ever see them?" Aaron leaned against the rough-hewn table. My parents died while I was away fighting. My brother runs the family ranch now with his wife and children. I write to them sometimes, but I haven't been back. I'm sorry about your parents, Harriet said softly. It's hard, isn't it? Becoming an orphan as an adult, people don't speak much of that kind of grief. Aaron nodded, surprised by her understanding. They expect you to bear it better because you're grown, as if age makes the loss easier. It doesn't, she said. It just means you know exactly what you've lost. They worked in companionable silence after that, each reflecting on their own losses. When the stew was ready, they ate by the fire, and Aaron found himself sharing stories of his childhood on the ranch, tales he hadn't spoken aloud in years. My brother and I once decided to break a wild Mustang without telling our father, he told her, smiling at the memory. I was 12, Thomas was 14. That horse threw us both so many times we were black and blue for weeks. Father found us trying to hide our bruises and gave us the worst scolding of our lives, not for trying to break the horse, but for being too proud to ask for help when we were clearly outmatched. Harriet laughed, and the sound transformed her face, bringing color to her cheeks and a sparkle to her eyes that made Aaron's breath catch unexpectedly. My sister and I once decided to make a cake for our mother's birthday, she shared in return. We were so determined to surprise her that we refused to ask the cook for help. The kitchen looked as if a flour mill had exploded, and the cake was inedible, hard as a rock on the outside, raw dough on the inside. Mother pretended to love it anyway. Aaron found himself smiling, drawn into the warmth of her story. You have a sister, Harriet's smile dimmed slightly. Margaret died of scarlet fever when she was 16. I was 14. I'm sorry, Aaron said, understanding all too well the hole that such a loss could leave in one's life. It was a long time ago, Harriet replied, but her eyes said differently. As night fell and the wind continued to moan outside, they sat by the fire, sharing more stories from their pasts. Aaron couldn't remember the last time he had talked so much, yet somehow it didn't feel tiresome as conversation often did for him. Harriet knew when to speak and when to listen, and she seemed genuinely interested in his words rather than simply waiting for her turn to talk. When Harriet yawned, Aaron realized how late it had grown. You should rest, he said, rising from his chair. Take the bed, I'm fine here. She frowned. You've slept in that chair for 3 nights now, Mr. Redfield. I can't continue to impose on you this way. It's no imposition, he assured her. I've slept in far worse places. Harriet looked as if she wanted to argue further, but another yawn overtook her and she relented. As she settled into the bed, she said softly, I believe the storm is finally beginning to ease. Tomorrow, if it's clear, we should be able to make our way to Cannon City. Aaron nodded, ignoring the unexpected twinge of regret at the thought. If you're strong enough, yes, it's about 15 miles from here. Will you be able to carry me that far? She asked, concern in her voice. You won't need carrying, he said. You're healing well and we'll take my horse. It'll be slow going through the snow, but we should make it by nightfall if we leave early. Harriet was quiet for a moment. I don't know how I'll ever repay you for all you've done, Mr. Redfield. Aaron shook his head. There's nothing to repay, Miss Neville. Get some rest now. As he settled into his chair for another night, Aaron found himself watching the gentle rise and fall of Harriet's chest as she slept. The thought of returning her to Cannon City tomorrow should have been a relief, a return to his solitude, an end to the disruption of his carefully ordered life. Instead, he felt an odd reluctance, as if something valuable would be lost when they parted ways. Foolishness, he told himself firmly. She's a refined Eastern lady with plans and prospects of her own. You're a solitary cowboy who prefers the company of horses to people. Tomorrow she'll return to her life, and you'll return to yours, and that's exactly as it should be. But as he drifted off to sleep, his dreams were filled with copper hair and green eyes that sparkled when she laughed. Morning dawned clear and cold, the storm finally spent after days of fury. The world outside Aaron's cabin was transformed into a pristine white landscape, beautiful but treacherous. The snow had drifted in places to heights taller than a man, and the journey to Cannon City would be challenging even on horseback. Harriet stood at the window, gazing out at the snow-covered mountains. She had dressed in her own clothes, now dry and mended where the bullet had torn through the fabric. Aaron had offered her one of his shirts to wear over her dress for added warmth, and she had gratefully accepted. "It's beautiful," she said as he joined her. "I've never seen anything like it." "The mountains are always at their most beautiful right after a storm," Aaron agreed. "Dangerous, but beautiful." He had prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush and coffee, and they ate quickly, both aware of the long journey ahead. "Are you certain you're strong enough for this?" Aaron asked as he helped her into his heavy coat. "We could wait another day if you need more time to recover." Harriet shook her head. "I've imposed on your hospitality long enough, Mr. Redfield. Besides, my aunt will be worried sick. The stagecoach was due days ago." Aaron nodded, understanding her concern. "We'll go slowly. Let me know if you need to rest." He gathered the few provisions they would need for the journey, then saddled his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Samson. When it was time to depart, he helped Harriet onto the horse, then mounted behind her. The closeness was unavoidable, his chest pressed against her back as he reached around her to take the reins. "Ready?" he asked, his breath warming her ear. Harriet nodded, and they set off into the snow-covered wilderness. The journey was as difficult as Aaron had anticipated. Samson struggled through the deep snow, and their progress was painfully slow. They talked little, both focused on the challenge of the terrain, but Aaron remained acutely aware of Harriet's presence before him, the way she leaned slightly into his chest when the horse navigated particularly difficult passages. By midday, they had covered perhaps a third of the distance to Cannon City. Aaron called a halt in a small clearing where the snow wasn't quite as deep, helping Harriet down from the horse so they could both stretch their legs and eat some of the jerky and hardtack he had packed. "How are you holding up?" he asked, noting the pallor of her face. "I'm fine," she insisted, but he could see the strain in her eyes. "Your wound is paining you," she didn't deny it. "A little, but I'll manage." Aaron wished he had something stronger than water to offer her for the pain, but his supplies were limited. "We'll rest a bit longer," he decided. "No use pushing too hard, we've made good progress." Harriet sat on a fallen log that Aaron had cleared of snow, gazing out at the vast expanse of white-covered landscape. "It's strange," she said after a moment. 4 days ago I thought I would die in this wilderness. Now I almost hate to leave it." Aaron glanced at her in surprise. "Most people can't wait to get back to civilization after being stranded." She smiled slightly. "Perhaps I'm not most people." "No," he agreed softly. "You're not." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the unexpected connection that had formed during their days of isolation together. Aaron looked away first, uncomfortable with the unfamiliar emotions stirring within him. "We should continue," he said, more gruffly than he intended. "There's still a long way to go." The afternoon's journey proved even more challenging than the morning's. The terrain grew steeper as they descended toward the valley where Cannon City lay, and twice they had to dismount and lead Samson through particularly treacherous passages. Harriet's strength began to flag noticeably, though she said nothing of it. Aaron could feel her trembling against him as they rode, and he cursed silently at his inability to make the journey easier for her. As the sun began to dip toward the western peaks, Aaron realized they would not reach Cannon City before nightfall as he had hoped. The cold was intensifying with the approach of evening, and Harriet's condition was deteriorating. "There's a line shack about a mile ahead," he told her, his mouth close to her ear to be heard above the wind. "Used by ranchers when they're moving cattle through these parts. We'll stop there for the night." Harriet didn't argue, which told him more clearly than words how exhausted she truly was. The line shack was a crude structure, little more than 4 walls and a roof, but it offered shelter from the cold and a small stove for heat. Aaron helped Harriet inside, then tended to Samson, making sure the horse was sheltered as best as possible in the lean-to attached to the shack. When he returned, he found Harriet sitting on the single narrow cot, her face drawn with pain and fatigue. "Let me check your wound," he said, concern evident in his voice. The ride may have reopened it. She nodded wearily, allowing him to help her remove his coat and examine the bandage at her side. A small spot of blood had seeped through, but the wound itself, when he carefully unwrapped it, looked clean and was beginning to heal properly. "It's not too bad," he assured her. "Just need to change the bandage." As he worked, Harriet watched his face, noting the gentle concentration in his expression. "You would have made a good doctor, Mr. Redfield," she said softly. He glanced up, surprised. "Never had the schooling for it, just picked up a few things during the war. Necessity teaches quickly." "Still, you have a healer's hands, gentle, despite their strength." Aaron felt heat rise to his face at her words. He finished rebandaging her wound in silence, then turned to the stove to start a fire. The interior of the shack warmed quickly once the stove was lit. Aaron prepared a simple meal from their provisions, and they ate in companionable silence, both too tired for much conversation. As night fell outside, the small space felt suddenly intimate. The single caught an awkward reminder of their situation. "You take the cot," Aaron said, spreading his bedroll on the floor. "I'll be fine here." Harriet frowned. "Mr. Redfield Aaron," she said, using his given name for the first time. "You've slept in a chair for 3 nights and ridden all day carrying both of us through deep snow. You need proper rest as much as I do." "I'm used to rough conditions," he insisted. "As am I after these past days," she countered. "The cot is wide enough for both of us if we're careful. It would be foolish for either of us to sleep on the cold floor when there's an alternative." Aaron stared at her, taken aback by her practical approach to what most women of her background would consider a scandalous suggestion. "Miss Neville, Harriet," she interrupted. "After all we've been through, I think we can dispense with such formalities, at least in private." He sighed, recognizing the determination in her eyes. "Harriet, then, but your reputation, my reputation, is hardly my most pressing concern at the moment," she said with a slight smile. "We're both adults and we're both exhausted. I trust you completely, and I imagine you respect me enough not to take advantage of the situation." "Of course I do," he said, almost offended by the suggestion that he might behave otherwise. "Then it's settled. We'll share the cot back to back and both get the rest we need for tomorrow's journey." Aaron wanted to argue further, but he was too tired and her logic was too sound. With reluctance, he agreed to her proposal. They settled onto the narrow cot, their backs touching, a line of warmth down Aaron's spine where Harriet's body pressed against his. Despite his exhaustion, sleep eluded him as he lay acutely aware of her presence, the soft sound of her breathing, the faint scent of her hair. "Aaron." Her voice came softly in the darkness. "Yes. Thank you, not just for saving me or tending my wound, but for treating me as a person worthy of respect. It's rarer than it should be." Aaron was silent for a moment, moved by her words. "You are worthy of respect," he said finally. "More than that." He felt her shift slightly, settling more comfortably against him. "Good night, Aaron. Good night, Harriet." As he drifted towards sleep, Aaron realized with a mixture of alarm and acceptance that somewhere during their brief acquaintance, Harriet Neville had slipped past the carefully constructed barriers he had built around his heart. The thought should have terrified him, but instead he found a strange peace in it as sleep finally claimed him. Morning came all too quickly, sunlight streaming through the single small window of the lined shack. Aaron woke to find that during the night they had shifted positions. Harriet was now curled against his chest, his arm draped protectively around her waist. For a moment he allowed himself to enjoy the closeness, the rightness of her body fitted against his. Then, remembering himself, he carefully disentangled and rose from the cot. Harriet stirred at his movement, opening her eyes to find him already dressed and stoking the fire in the stove. "Good morning," she said, sitting up slowly. "Morning," he replied, not quite meeting her eyes. "How's the wound today?" She touched her side experimentally. "Better, I think." "Less painful." "Good. We should reach Cannon City by midday if we make good time." They ate a quick breakfast and prepared for the final leg of their journey. Outside, the day was bright and cold, the sun glinting off the snow in a dazzling display. Aaron helped Harriet onto Samson, then mounted behind her as before. The ride to Cannon City was easier than the previous day's journey. The terrain grew less rugged as they descended into the valley, and the snow was not as deep at the lower elevations. By mid-morning they could see the town in the distance, smoke rising from chimneys against the backdrop of the mountains. "Almost there," Aaron said, but there was no joy in his voice. Harriet nodded, her own feelings similarly mixed. She had spent only a few days in Aaron's company, yet the thought of parting from him left an unexpected ache in her chest. He had become important to her in ways she had not anticipated when he had first carried her from the snow. Cannon City had grown considerably since Aaron's last visit. The territorial prison dominated the northern edge of town, a stark stone structure that contrasted with the wooden buildings of the main street. People moved about their business, many stopping to stare at the snow-covered riders as they made their way into town. "My aunt's house is on Oak Street," Harriet said. "It's just past the church, I believe." Aaron nodded, guiding Samson through the rutted, snow-filled streets. The house, when they found it, was a neat two-story structure painted white with green trim. Smoke curled invitingly from its chimney, suggesting warmth and comfort within. Aaron helped Harriet dismount, steadying her when she swayed slightly on her feet. "Are you all right?" "Just a little lightheaded," she assured him. "It will pass." They stood awkwardly for a moment, neither quite ready for the farewell that must come. The door of the house flew open, interrupting whatever Harriet had been about to say. A woman rushed out, gray-streaked hair escaping from a hasty bun, her face lined with worry that transformed into relief at the sight of Harriet. "Harriet, thank God, we've been out of our minds with worry." She engulfed Harriet in a fierce embrace, then stepped back to examine her with concern. "The stagecoach arrived days ago with word that you had set out on foot with some of the other passengers. When you didn't arrive, we feared the worst. The sheriff organized a search party, but the blizzard made it impossible to get far." "I'm all right, Aunt Martha," Harriet assured her. "Thanks to Mr. Redfield, he saved my life." Martha turned to Aaron, noticing him properly for the first time. "Mr. Redfield, you found my niece." Aaron shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. "Yes, madam, she was injured and caught in the storm. I brought her to my cabin until it passed, then escorted her here." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, there aren't words enough to express our gratitude." She looked back at Harriet. "But you're injured, what happened?" Harriet glanced at Aaron before answering. "It's a long story, Aunt Martha, I should tell you inside." Martha nodded, then turned back to Aaron. "Mr. Redfield, you must come in as well. It's the least we can do after what you've done for Harriet." Aaron hesitated. "Thank you, madam, but I should be getting back. My horse needs tending, and I've been away from my cabin longer than I planned." "Nonsense," Martha insisted. "Your horse can rest in our stable, and you'll stay for dinner at the very least. I won't take no for an answer." Aaron looked to Harriet, who gave him a small smile. "Please, Aaron. Let us show you some small measure of hospitality in return for yours." Unable to refuse both women, Aaron reluctantly agreed. "I'll just see to Samson first, if that's all right." "Of course," Martha said. "The stable is just around back. Come in when you're finished." As the women went inside, Aaron led Samson to the stable, taking his time with the familiar tasks of unsaddling and grooming his horse. He was stalling, and he knew it. The prospect of sitting in a proper parlor, making polite conversation, filled him with dread. He had lived so long apart from such social niceties that he hardly remembered how to behave in civilized company. More than that, he feared what might happen when he and Harriet said their final goodbyes. The connection between them had grown strong during their days together, but it had existed in isolation, separate from the real world with all its complications and expectations. Here in Cannon City, in her aunt's respectable home, Aaron was acutely aware of the differences between them, differences that made any deeper relationship impossible. Eventually, he could delay no longer. With a final pat to Samson's neck, Aaron made his way to the front door of the house. Martha welcomed him warmly, ushering him into a comfortable parlor where a fire blazed in the hearth. The room was modestly but tastefully furnished, reflecting a genteel lifestyle that Aaron had long since abandoned. Harriet was seated on a sofa, a cup of tea in her hands. She had changed into a fresh dress, her hair neatly arranged, and for a moment, Aaron hardly recognized her. This was Harriet Neville, as she was meant to be seen, a proper Eastern lady, refined and elegant. The woman he had come to know, resilient, practical, unafraid of hardship, seemed suddenly distant. "Mr. Redfield," she said formally, though her eyes held a warmth that was for him alone. "Please sit down." A man rose from an armchair near the fire, stepping forward with an outstretched hand. "Mr. Redfield, I'm Edward Neville, Martha's husband. We cannot thank you enough for what you've done for our niece." Aaron shook his hand awkwardly. "No thanks necessary, sir. Anyone would have done the same." "I think we all know that's not true," Edward said gravely. "Please make yourself comfortable. Martha has prepared a special dinner in your honor." The next few hours passed in a blur of uncomfortable formality for Aaron. He answered questions about how he had found Harriet, careful to omit certain details that might raise eyebrows. He learned that Edward was a judge appointed to the territorial court, and that Martha was active in Cannon City's small but growing social circle. They had no children of their own, which was why they had invited Harriet to come live with them after her parents' deaths. Throughout dinner, Aaron was painfully aware of the proper table settings, the servant who brought each course, the polite conversation that never touched on anything of real substance. Harriet spoke little, though her eyes often met his across the table, conveying an understanding of his discomfort that no one else seemed to notice. When the meal was finished, Edward invited Aaron to join him for a cigar in his study. Reluctantly, Aaron agreed, leaving Harriet and Martha in the parlor. "Harriet tells me you live alone in the mountains," Edward said as he offered Aaron a cigar. "Yes, sir, have done for 5 years now." "And what do you do for a living, Mr. Redfield?" Aaron took a careful draw on the cigar, buying time. "I break horses, mostly, sell them in town when I need supplies, do some trapping in the winter. It's a simple life, but it suits me." Edward nodded thoughtfully. "A man of independence, I can respect that." He paused before adding, "Harriet also mentioned that you fought in the war, for the South." Aaron tensed, unsure where this was leading. "Yes, sir, I was with the Texas Cavalry." To his surprise, Edward showed no sign of disapproval. "I was with the Union myself, Massachusetts Regiment." "Terrible business, that war, tore the country apart." He studied Aaron's face. "Left its mark on all of us who fought, I imagine." Aaron nodded, surprised by the judge's understanding. "Some marks aren't visible to the eye." "Indeed," Edward agreed. "Harriet's father, my brother, never fully recovered from what he saw. Different war, different enemy, but the effect was the same. Some men aren't built to carry such memories." They smoked in silence for a moment before Edward spoke again. "My niece thinks very highly of you, Mr. Redfield. She says you treated her with nothing but respect and kindness during your time together." "She's an extraordinary woman," Aaron said before he could stop himself. Edward's eyebrows rose slightly. "Yes, she is. Intelligent, strong-willed, and far too independent for her own good sometimes." He tapped his cigar against an ashtray. "She's had offers of marriage, you know, several, turned them all down, said she couldn't respect a man who saw her only as an ornament or a convenience." Aaron wasn't sure how to respond, so he remained silent. "I tell you this," Edward continued, "because I want you to understand something. My wife and I care deeply for Harriet. We want her happiness above all else. If that happiness should come in an unexpected form, we would not stand in its way." Aaron stared at him, startled by the implication. "Sir," Edward held up a hand. "I'm not presuming anything, Mr. Redfield. I'm merely making an observation. Now, shall we rejoin the ladies? I believe Martha mentioned something about dessert." In the parlor, Harriet and Martha were engaged in quiet conversation that ceased when the men entered. Aaron caught Harriet's eye, and something in his expression must have betrayed his confusion, for she looked at him quizzically. The evening progressed with dessert and coffee, more polite conversation, and finally, inevitably, the time for Aaron's departure. "You must stay the night, Mr. Redfield," Martha insisted. "It's too late to start back to your cabin now." Aaron shook his head. "Thank you, madam, but I prefer to make use of what daylight remains. I know these mountains well enough to find my way." "At least allow us to offer you provisions for your journey," Edward said, "and please know that you are welcome in our home anytime." Aaron thanked them, accepting a package of food from Martha and enduring her effusive expressions of gratitude with as much grace as he could muster. Finally, it was time to say goodbye to Harriet. She walked with him to the stable, neither speaking until they were out of earshot of the house. "You're really leaving now?" she asked, her voice soft in the gathering twilight. Aaron nodded, focusing on saddling Samson. "Best to get a few miles behind me before full dark." Harriet was silent for a moment. "Will I see you again?" He paused, his hands stilling on the saddle strap. "I don't often come to town." "I see." Her voice was carefully neutral. Aaron turned to face her, struggling to find the right words. "Harriet, you have a life here now, a good one from what I can tell. Your aunt and uncle are fine people. You'll meet others, make friends, perhaps find—" He stopped, unable to complete the thought. "Perhaps find what, Aaron?" she pressed, stepping closer to him. "A husband, is that what you were going to say?" He couldn't meet her eyes. "You deserve someone who can give you the kind of life you're accustomed to, not a solitary cowboy with nothing to offer but a crude cabin and a life of hardship." "Shouldn't I be the one to decide what I deserve?" Harriet asked, a hint of fire in her voice. "What I want." Aaron finally looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "And what do you want, Harriet?" "I want to know that these past days meant something," she said quietly. "That the connection I felt between us wasn't just gratitude or the unusual circumstances of our meeting." Aaron reached out, unable to stop himself, and touched her cheek gently. "It wasn't just gratitude," he admitted. "Not for me." Harriet leaned into his touch. "Then don't leave like this. Come back to Cannon City. Visit. Give us a chance to know each other in the ordinary world, not just in a crisis." Aaron wanted to promise her that he would, but he hesitated. "I don't belong in town, Harriet. I left that world behind for good reason. Then I'll come to you," she said with determination. "I can ride. My uncle has horses. I could visit your cabin." The image of Harriet riding through the wilderness alone after what had happened to her made Aaron's blood run cold. "No, it's too dangerous," Harriet's eyes flashed. "So you would simply walk away after everything?" "It's for the best," he said, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. She stepped back from him, hurt and anger warring in her expression. "I see. Well, thank you again for saving my life, Mr. Redfield. I won't forget your kindness." Her formal tone cut deeper than any angry words could have. Aaron mounted Samson, looking down at her one last time. There was so much he wanted to say, but the words wouldn't come. "Goodbye, Harriet," he said finally. "Goodbye, Aaron," she replied, her voice steady despite the brightness of unshed tears in her eyes. He rode away without looking back, knowing that if he did, his resolve would crumble. It was better this way, he told himself. Better for her, if not for him. She deserved more than he could give her: a proper home, a man who could move easily in society, a future unmarred by the darkness that sometimes still haunted his dreams. As Samson carried him out of Cannon City and back toward the mountains, Aaron tried to convince himself that he had done the right thing. But the ache in his chest told a different story. Harriet watched Aaron ride away until he was nothing more than a distant figure against the white landscape. Only when he had disappeared entirely did she allow the tears to fall, quickly wiping them away before returning to the house. "He's gone?" Martha asked when Harriet entered the parlor. "Yes," Harriet replied, forcing a smile. "He was anxious to get back before dark." Martha studied her niece's face. "You care for him?" It wasn't a question, and Harriet didn't bother to deny it. "It doesn't matter, he's made his choice." "Men can be stubborn creatures," Martha said, patting the sofa beside her an invitation, "especially proud ones." Harriet sat, leaning her head against her aunt's shoulder as she had often done with her mother. "He thinks he's not good enough for me, that I belong in a world he can't be part of." "And what do you think?" Harriet considered the question carefully. "I think he's a better man than he believes himself to be. I think the world he's created for himself is lonely but safe, and he's afraid to risk that safety." She sighed. "But I also think I can't force him to see what I see." Martha stroked her hair gently. "Give him time, dear. Sometimes a man needs to come to certain realizations on his own. And if he doesn't, then you'll heal and move forward, as we all must do with disappointments in life." Martha kissed the top of Harriet's head, "but I have a feeling that Mr. Redfield may surprise you yet. There was something in the way he looked at you, something I haven't often seen in my long years." Harriet wanted to believe her aunt, but as days turned into weeks with no word from Aaron, hope began to fade. She settled into life in Cannon City, helping Martha with her charitable work and occasionally assisting Edward with clerical tasks at the courthouse. She met people, made a few friends, and even received an offer of courtship from a young lawyer that she politely declined. Through it all, she found her thoughts returning to the cabin in the mountains, to the quiet strength of the man who had carried her through the snow without complaint, who had tended her wound with gentle hands, who had shared stories of his past in the flickering firelight. She wondered if he thought of her at all, or if he had managed to return to his solitary life as if their paths had never crossed. Aaron, meanwhile, had indeed tried to resume his former existence. He broke horses, hunted, chopped wood, and performed all the familiar tasks that had structured his days before Harriet, but nothing felt the same. The cabin seemed too quiet, the silence that had once been comforting now oppressive. At night, he would find himself staring at the bed where she had slept, remembering the sound of her voice, the warmth of her body pressed against his in the lined shack, the look in her eyes when he had ridden away. A month after their parting, Aaron rode into Cannon City with the intention of selling 2 horses he had recently broken. He told himself that his decision had nothing to do with Harriet, that it was simply time to replenish his supplies. But as he approached the town, his heart raced with the possibility of seeing her again. He conducted his business at the livery, negotiating a fair price for the horses, then purchased the supplies he needed at the general store. All the while, his eyes scanned the street, searching for a glimpse of copper hair and green eyes. "Mr. Redfield," the voice came from behind him as he was loading his purchases onto his pack horse. Aaron turned to find Edward Neville standing there, his expression unreadable. "Judge Neville," Aaron greeted him, removing his hat. "Good day to you, sir." "I thought that was you in town for supplies." Aaron nodded. "Sold a couple of horses as well. How have you been, sir?" "Well enough," Edward replied. He studied Aaron's face for a moment. "And you?" "How is life in the mountains?" "Same as always," Aaron said, though they both knew it wasn't true. Edward nodded thoughtfully. "Harriet often walks in the park at this time of day, just across from the courthouse." He gestured down the street, "in case you were wondering." Before Aaron could respond, Edward tipped his hat and continued on his way, leaving Aaron to consider the implicit invitation. The park was a small, neatly kept square of green in the center of town, with benches placed beneath shade trees that were just beginning to bud with the approach of spring. Aaron spotted Harriet immediately, seated on a bench with a book open in her lap. She wasn't reading, though. Her gaze was fixed on something in the distance, her expression pensive. Aaron stood at the edge of the park, suddenly uncertain. What right did he have to disrupt her life again after walking away? What could he possibly say that would make his abandonment less hurtful? As if sensing his presence, Harriet turned and saw him. Her book slipped from her lap as she stood, her eyes wide with surprise. Aaron forced himself to move forward to cross the space between them. When he reached her, he removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. "Hello, Harriet." "Aaron," she said, her voice steady despite the color that had risen to her cheeks. "This is unexpected. I was in town, selling horses." He gestured vaguely toward the livery. "Your uncle mentioned I might find you here." Harriet raised an eyebrow. "Did he? How convenient." Aaron smiled slightly at her dry tone. "I think he might have been playing matchmaker. And would that be so terrible?" she asked, a challenge in her voice. Aaron really looked at her for the first time since their parting. She was even more beautiful than he remembered, her eyes bright, her skin glowing with health. The wounded woman he had carried through the snow was gone, replaced by this vibrant, confident person who stood before him now. "No," he said softly, "not terrible at all." Harriet's expression softened. "Why are you really here, Aaron?" "Because I couldn't stay away," he admitted, the truth finally breaking free. "Because my cabin is too empty without you in it. Because I've thought of nothing but you since the day I rode away." Harriet took a step closer to him. "I've missed you too," she said simply. They stood in silence for a moment, the distance between them both physical and emotional, neither quite sure how to bridge it. "Walk with me?" Harriet finally asked, gesturing toward a path that wound through the park. Aaron nodded, falling into step beside her. They walked without speaking at first, the silence between them gradually becoming more comfortable. "I was wrong to leave as I did," Aaron said at last. "I told myself I was doing what was best for you, but really I was protecting myself. I was afraid." Harriet glanced at him. Afraid of what? Of caring too much, of not being enough, of failing you? He stopped walking and turned to face her. "I've been alone for so long, Harriet. I'm not sure I remember how to be anything else." "I'm not asking you to be anything other than who you are," she said gently. "The man who carried me through a blizzard, the man who tended my wounds and shared his stories by firelight, that's the man I came to care for." Aaron took her hands in his, marveling at how small they were compared to his own. "What I'm trying to say badly is that I love you, Harriet Neville. I think I have since the moment I found you in the snow, and if you'll give me another chance, I'd like to prove it to you." Harriet's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy. "I love you too, Aaron Redfield. I think I have since you carried me for miles without a single complaint." Aaron brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb, then leaned down to press his lips gently to hers. The kiss was soft, tentative at first, then deepening as Harriet's arms came around his neck. When they finally parted, Aaron rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know what happens now," he admitted. "I still live in a cabin in the mountains. You still belong here with your family." Harriet smiled up at him. "Perhaps we don't have to choose. Cannon City isn't so far from your cabin. We could find a middle ground." "Are you proposing a compromise, Miss Neville?" Aaron asked, a smile tugging at his lips. "I'm proposing that we figure it out together," she replied. "After all, we've already survived a blizzard. Surely we can navigate this." Aaron laughed, a full, joyous sound that surprised them both. "When you put it that way, how can I argue?" They walked back to her aunt and uncle's house hand in hand, both aware that many challenges lay ahead, but confident in the strength of the bond between them. A bond forged in snow and hardship, tested by separation, and now ready to be nurtured in the warmth of mutual love and respect. The news of their courtship raised a few eyebrows in Cannon City's small social circle, but the approval of Judge Neville and his wife silenced most criticism. Aaron found himself increasingly comfortable visiting town, while Harriet discovered unexpected joy in the simplicity of life at Aaron's cabin during her visits there. As spring gave way to summer, Aaron set about expanding his cabin, adding a second room and improving the furnishings. With Harriet's encouragement, he also began to break and train more horses, building a reputation that brought buyers from as far away as Denver. Their wedding took place in late September, when the aspen trees had turned to gold and the mountains were ablaze with autumn color. It was a simple ceremony in Cannon City's small church, attended by Martha and Edward, a few friends Harriet had made in town, and to Aaron's surprise, his brother Thomas, who had traveled from Texas after receiving Aaron's letter. "Never thought I'd see the day," Thomas said, embracing Aaron after the ceremony. "My hermit brother married to the prettiest girl in Colorado Territory." "Luckiest man alive," Aaron agreed, his eyes finding Harriet across the room, radiant in a simple white dress with wildflowers in her hair. Their life together unfolded as a balance between Aaron's beloved mountains and Harriet's connections in town. They spent most of their time at the expanded cabin, which gradually became a true home under Harriet's touch. Aaron continued to break horses, while Harriet started a small school for the children of nearby ranchers, putting her teaching experience to good use. They visited Cannon City regularly, staying with Martha and Edward, maintaining the relationships that were important to Harriet while building new ones together. Aaron found, to his surprise, that he no longer dreaded these visits to town. With Harriet by his side, he discovered a capacity for friendship and community that he had thought lost to him after the war. In the spring of their second year of marriage, Harriet gave birth to a son they named William, after her father. 2 years later, a daughter followed, whom they called Elizabeth, after Aaron's mother. The cabin expanded again to accommodate their growing family, and Aaron's horse business flourished, allowing them to hire help and improve their property. Through the years, they never forgot how they had found each other. On the anniversary of the day Aaron had discovered Harriet in the snow, they would ride together to the spot where their paths had first crossed, now marked by a simple stone cairn. "Do you ever regret it?" Aaron asked on one such anniversary, their 10th, as they sat by the cairn, watching their children play in the summer meadow that had once been buried in snow. "Marrying a rough cowboy instead of some city gentleman." Harriet leaned against his shoulder, her copper hair now streaked with a few strands of silver. "Not for a single moment," she assured him. "You carried me when I was too weak to walk, and you've been carrying me in your heart ever since. What more could any woman ask for?" Aaron wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "I'm the one who was carried," he said softly, "out of darkness, out of loneliness. You saved me, Harriet, as surely as I saved you." "Then I suppose we saved each other," she replied, tilting her face up to his for a kiss. As they rode home that evening, their children chattering excitedly about the deer they had spotted in the woods, Aaron reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From solitary cowboy to husband and father, from a man haunted by the past to one embracing the future. All because he had found a woman left in the snow, too weak to walk, and carried her to safety without complaint. It was, he decided, the best decision he had ever made.